Absolutely, I get it. Yeah, I'm fully in accord with you. Certainly, I shall ensure compliance, Susan said, barely hiding her irritation as she listened to the endless chatter of the board chairman's wife at Birch Grove Mansion and Museum. As the development director, Susan Morgan knew she had to play along, even though she often found wealthy people meddling and annoying. I'm so tired of rich people thinking they can run everything, she muttered under her breath. Glancing at her watch, Susan grew more frustrated because she was late for another meeting. Just as she was about to cut the conversation short, the old woman noticed the time herself. Oh dear, I must go, or I'll be late for my hair appointment. No problem, Mrs. Worthington. My apologies for holding you up, Susan responded genuinely. After hanging up, Susan texted her husband, Dinner with a prospect. Don't wait up. She quickly tidied her desk, checked her makeup, and left her office, which used to be a butler's pantry in the mansion. As she left, her secretary, Evita, called out, Are you leaving, Senor Morgan? Without stopping, Susan replied over her shoulder, Yes, I'm meeting a donor. I won't be back today. Once the woman was gone, Evita hurried down the hallway to the executive director's office, stopping at his secretary's desk. Is he gone? She asked Christina. Yes, Christina replied. He left about 10 minutes ago. He mentioned having an important meeting. Evita smirked. Like clockwork. Every week, same time. Both of them have meetings? They think we don't know what's really going on? She glanced towards the exit and muttered, Ridiculous. The two young women chuckled and resumed their work. Professor Daniel Morgan, a husband of Susan, looked over his intro to econ class, aware that only a few students might stick with economics. He decided to use a unique teaching method to pique their interest. He displayed a graph on the wall from his tablet and started, Today, we're talking about supply, demand, and price. This caused some groans and laughter in the class. Ignoring the interruption, he continued, It might sound boring, but these ideas really shape our world. Let me show you. He held up an artwork. Anyone know this? He asked. Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol, one student responded. Wrong class, miss. You want art appreciation next door, Daniel joked, causing more laughter. Once the class settled down, he explained, Actually, she's right. Why discuss Warhol in econ? Last year, a Warhol sold for $195 million, the priciest by an American artist. Some students were impressed. I'm guessing no buyers here? He joked again, getting some laughs. No billionaires today? Well, the point is, one person might pay $195 million, but many would buy a $20 print. The price makes the difference. At $195 million, it's just one buyer, but at $20, everyone's interested. He wrapped up. There's a lot that affects demand, and we'll get to that, but remember, price drives demand a lot. Back in his office, he stashed away the Monroe artwork and checked his messages. Susan would be out again, giving him a chance to visit his father, Ezra, who had Parkinson's, but insisted on living independently. Despite this, Daniel visited often as he saw his father's condition deteriorating. During a phone call, Ezra talked about his health and various global issues. Daniel offered to come over, and though his dad initially resisted, he ended up inviting Daniel for dinner, handing the phone to Paloma. Paloma was Ezra's live-in nurse, staying even after Ezra had driven other caregivers away, thanks to her resilience and Ezra's fondness for her. Daniel felt relieved they had found someone like her. However, Paloma announced she needed to leave due to personal reasons, which upset Daniel. Ezra quickly suggested she move into his large house to save money and offered to help with expenses. Daniel worried about Paloma's son, Marco, being too much for Ezra, but Ezra dismissed his concerns, looking forward to the company. Paloma met with Daniel to discuss the arrangement. Surprised, but seeing potential benefits for his father, Daniel told her it was her decision, but suggested it could be beneficial for everyone, especially if Daniel visited more often. Paloma agreed, thinking it could work well for her and Marco. Daniel was surprised when Paloma blushed and left quickly, but he was happy to hear she accepted his father's offer. 18 months later, Daniel wasn't shocked to see his dad listening to Paloma and joining her for dinner, which he preferred over eating alone. Paloma was not only a skilled nurse, but also an excellent cook. A home-cooked meal will be a nice change, Daniel thought, feeling optimistic. Susan wasn't fond of the long drive through the countryside to meet with Grant for their developing prospects, but she knew it was necessary to keep their meetings discreet. The drive reminded her of her past, especially passing the small, run-down houses, similar to where she lived after her father left when she was young. Her family struggled, but she excelled academically, earning a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. Education was her escape from poverty. Things changed in her junior year when she met Daniel Morgan, a charming econ TA. Despite the rules, they connected deeply. Susan had casual relationships before, but saw a serious future with Daniel. She imagined him aiming for a high-profile financial or consulting job, but he chose academia instead. Initially disappointed, Susan held on to hope he might become a university president one day, and some online research supported that possibility. However, after 7 years of marriage, she found herself living in a small university town with a husband content teaching at an obscure university. "This isn't the future I envisioned," she cursed. Susan landed a fundraising job at a local museum in a mansion once owned by an oil baron. She found herself dealing with wealthy patrons and their demanding children again, but she was determined to move on to better things as she drove past the motel where she first met Grant. Before Daniel could get out of the car at his father's, Marco, a young boy, excitedly ran up to him. "Senor Daniel, want to play soccer?" he yelled. "Marco, leave Senor Daniel be," Paloma shouted from the porch. "It's okay, Paloma. Let's play, Marco," Daniel replied, and they started kicking the soccer ball around. Daniel noticed Paloma had brought his father out to watch, and he cheered them on, despite never being a soccer fan. When called in for dinner, Marco was reluctant to stop, but Daniel was ready for a break. Expecting Latin American food, he was surprised by a Mediterranean meal of chicken kebabs, rice, Greek salad, and pita bread. Ezra complained about wanting a burger but ate everything. The meal felt like a family gathering, lifting Daniel's spirits, and he realized he hadn't thought about Susan since he got there. As they cleaned up, Paloma mentioned she tried to keep Ezra on a Mediterranean diet for his heart health. "Thanks, Paloma. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Dad seems more lively lately." Back in the den, Daniel saw his father had also fallen asleep. He helped Paloma move him to bed, noticing his father's frailty. After saying he'd leave soon, Paloma hesitated, but then asked, "Could you tell me about that painting in the living room?" "Of course," Daniel agreed, leading her to a framed Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe. "How did your dad get this painting?" Paloma inquired. Daniel shared that his grandfather, originally a printer in Germany, immigrated to the U.S., where the name Morgan was given at Ellis Island. His dad learned silkscreen printing in New York and worked late one night for Warhol, who gifted him the artist's proof, signing a dedication on the back. That was quite a gesture for someone he barely knew. True, but back then, Warhol's pieces were only a few $100s. He didn't see much value in an artist's proof until later. "But isn't keeping it here a bit risky?" Paloma asked. "Not many people know my dad as a Warhol, and it's never been appraised. But after that auction got a lot of attention, we had to do something. That's when my dad beefed up security. It's not foolproof, but even touching the wall sets off the security." She glanced at the painting again. "I can see why your father wants to keep it here. He must be really proud of it." "He is," Daniel agreed, "and I'm proud of him too." Paloma smiled and nodded. As Susan left the motel, she still felt the pleasurable aftermath. Grant Nicholson was excellent in bed, partly because he was head over heels for her. His passion was evident, and he was eager to satisfy her every desire. But as she left their rundown hideaway, her mind wandered to her husband. "Daniel isn't a bad husband, and he's decent in bed, but he lacks the ambition and passion I crave. Grant thrives among millionaires on the board, while Daniel's content with university gatherings and mingling with faculty. I can't stand those events." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "But once Daniel inherits from his old man, I'll divorce him without a second thought. With my share of the Warhol and the house, I'll have as much money as those rich women, plus a prominent husband." Pulling into their driveway, her face twisted into a sneer. "University housing. I can tolerate this dump a bit longer. And my husband, too." The next time Daniel saw Paloma, her usual smile was missing. He had just finished grading an exam when he heard a knock on his office door. Startled, he looked up to see her standing there, her expression causing alarm. "What's the matter, Paloma? Is something wrong with my dad? Is Marco all right?" She entered quickly, shutting the door behind her, and took a seat in one of the chairs. "Your dad is okay, Daniel. My mom is looking after him and Marco while I'm here." But, impatiently, he shook his head. "So, what's the problem? What's going on? You know I have a big family around here, right?" "I didn't, but go ahead." "One of my sisters, Christina, works at Birch Grove. She's Senor Nicholson's secretary." "Okay. Anyway, Christina sees Mrs. Morgan at the mansion every day." "Yes, but, Daniel, I'm sorry, but your wife and Senor Nicholson are having an affair." Her words hit him hard. His first reaction was denial because he didn't want to believe it. But considering his strained relationship with his wife, he quickly saw how an affair would explain everything. Composing himself, he leaned forward. "How does your sister know this?" he asked urgently. Paloma looked distressed. We have a cousin who works as a maid at the Pocono View Motel. It's up north, about 20 miles en route. He gestured impatiently, and she continued. Your wife and Senor Nicholson meet there almost every week. The last time was 2 days ago, the night you had dinner with Senor Morgan, Marco, and me. He clenched his jaw, recalling that night and Susan's late arrival to bed, but he kept his voice calm. Paloma, this is serious. I can't just trust the word of someone I've never met, even if she's your cousin. I understand, but you don't have to take her word for it. Could we go there now? 30 minutes later at the motel, Paloma introduced Daniel to her cousin Lourdes, who struggled with English. With Paloma translating, Lourdes led them to a maintenance closet in the motel hallway. She pulled out a hidden recording device from the ventilation system. Daniel looked at Lourdes, then Paloma. How did this get here? He asked sharply. Our family was together, and Christina shared her suspicions about Senor Nicholson and his frequent meetings with Senora Morgan. When she showed us a picture, Lourdes recognized them as the couple who visited the motel regularly. Paloma looked at Daniel earnestly. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I had to know the truth. I gave Lourdes the recorder. I hope you won't resent me for it. Ignoring her question, Daniel pointed to the device. Have you listened to this? He demanded. She hung her head. Yes, I heard part of it. Lourdes played it for me when she called. That's when I knew I had to tell you. Okay, Daniel said grimly. Ask her to play the tape. When Lourdes pressed the play button, the volume startled them all. Oh my God, Grant, right there. Yes, don't stop. Erupted from the small speaker. Lourdes quickly stopped the playback and spoke to Paloma. Do you want her to start from the beginning? Paloma asked Daniel. A pale-faced Daniel shook his head. No, I recognize Susan's voice. I really don't want to hear the whole thing. Let's just move forward from here. The cousin adjusted the volume and hit play. Initially, there was just the sound of rustling sheets and the creaking of the bed. Then the lovers' conversation resumed. God, Susan, you're incredible. I can't get enough of you, Grant Nicholson's voice praised. Then it became urgent. Honestly, baby, I don't want to wait any longer. Just say the word and I'll divorce my wife tomorrow. I just want to be with you. No, Susan's voice snapped. Can't you see, Grant? We can't do anything until Daniel's father passes. Once he's gone and Daniel inherits the Warhol, then I can divorce him. He'll have to sell it off as part of the settlement, and I'll get my share of the money. After that, you can kiss Greta goodbye and we'll finally be together. Are you sure you'll get half of the Warhol? I thought inheritances were off limits. Susan's voice carried a smirk. Don't worry about that. I have a lawyer who knows how to work around it, and since he's paid based on the settlement size, trust me, he's highly motivated. Yeah, but how much longer do we have to wait? Nicholson whined. Be patient, darling, Susan reassured. The old man's health is declining rapidly. We'll get what we want soon enough. Daniel angrily hit the off button. What a scheming woman. She has it all planned out. He slammed his fist down, startling the two women. Then he stormed out of the motel. Paloma quickly hugged Lourdes, grabbed the recorder, and hurried to the parking lot. Daniel stood by his car, lost in thought. When she approached, his eyes showed both anger and despair of someone betrayed. I put in so much effort, Paloma. I knew she wasn't happy in our marriage, but I kept trying to fix things, he said, his face turning serious. Now I understand why nothing worked. With determination in his voice, he said, Get in the car, we need to head back to town. She sat in the passenger seat, then timidly spoke up once they were on the road. I hope you're not upset with me, Daniel. I felt you needed to know what she was up to. Shaking his head, he replied, I'm not mad at you, Paloma, but I'm furious at Susan. What will you do? You're not planning to harm her, are you? Glancing at her, he replied, Yes, I'm going to confront her and Nicholson. Seeing her worried look, he reassured, But not in the way you might think. I'm not a violent guy, but trust me, they won't like what's coming. She reached out to touch his arm. I don't want you to get in trouble, Daniel. I just couldn't. He gave her a small smile. Don't worry, Paloma, everything will be fine. Then his expression turned serious. While you handle your mother and Marco, I need to talk to my dad. He was thrilled when I married Susan. He thought highly of her, was eager for us to have kids. When he hears the truth, he'll be just as upset as I am. With a wry smile, he added, It's funny, isn't it? I used to get frustrated when Susan delayed starting a family, but now I'm grateful we didn't. The rest of the journey was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The talk with his dad was tough, but they finally made a plan. Daniel's first move was to file for divorce to stop Susan's scheme. His dad promised to recommend a divorce lawyer, warning Daniel not to tip off Susan about what he knew. I got it, Dad, Daniel agreed. I'll just keep my distance until I'm ready to serve her. We barely see each other anyway, so it shouldn't be too tough. To keep busy and hide his emotions, Daniel spent the weekend grading papers and prepping lessons. When his dad referred him to a lawyer on Monday, Daniel eagerly set up a meeting. But he was disappointed to hear he couldn't see the attorney until Thursday. If Susan tries anything, I need a top-notch lawyer, he reasoned. I can wait a bit longer. Come Thursday, Daniel was relieved he'd waited. His new attorney seemed capable and confident. I think I know Susan's plan, but don't worry about your dad's painting, she assured him. If we file fast, the Warhol won't be part of any settlement. She promised to have his case ready by the following week and could serve the writ the same day. Almost there, Daniel thought as he headed back to campus. And maybe we'll handle Grant Nicholson, too. For the first time since discovering Susan's betrayal, he felt a bit of relief. But his peace shattered on Sunday with a devastating call. Through sobs, Paloma apologized. I did everything I could to help him, she cried. Fear gripped Daniel. Who, Paloma? What happened? It's Mr. Morgan, she cried. Then the line went silent as the EMTs arrived. Daniel leaped up and dashed to his car, racing to his father's place. Fire trucks, ambulances, and fire department vehicles clogged the street. Parking nearby, he sprinted to the house, arriving just as the EMTs wheeled out a stretcher onto the porch. Is he okay? He asked urgently. The technician glanced at him. Are you the son? Yeah, that's me. Is he alive? The man shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, we couldn't save him. He was gone when we got here. His heart had stopped. Looked like a massive stroke or an aneurysm. But defibrillation? Could that have helped? The man sympathetically shook his head. Sorry, sir. Even if we restarted his heart, he'd still be gone. You wouldn't want that, and neither would he. As the ambulance pulled away, Daniel stood there, stunned. Eventually, he mustered the strength to enter the house. Seeing him, Paloma rushed over, crying as she embraced him. I'm sorry, Daniel. I tried so hard to save him. I did CPR until the medics arrived, but it wasn't enough. I'm so sorry. Through his own tears, he held her at arm's length. It's not your fault, Paloma. You did everything you could. The EMT told me Dad likely had a stroke or an aneurysm. He was probably gone before you even got to him. She buried her head in his chest, sobbing. He was talking to me at the table. Suddenly, he grabbed his head, said it hurt, then collapsed. Oh, Daniel, it was awful. He gently guided her to a chair and fetched water for both of them. Where's Marco? He asked upon returning. Marco? Oh, God, I forgot. He's at school. I need to go get him. She broke into tears again. He'll be devastated. He really loved your father. With that, she rushed off, leaving Daniel alone in the now empty house. He sat there for a while, feeling overwhelmed by grief as he tried to grasp how quickly his life had turned upside down. He knew his father's health was declining, but losing him so suddenly caught him off guard. Tears streamed down his face, and there was no one around to console him. Eventually, he pulled himself together enough to make a list of people he needed to inform and tasks he needed to handle. Once he had everything written down, he began the difficult task of making phone calls to share the sad news. After reaching out to the most urgent contacts, Daniel locked up his father's house and drove to Birch Grove, saving the hardest conversation for last. Despite his reluctance, he decided to break the news to Susan face to face. I want to see her reaction, he thought bitterly. Her surprise was evident when he entered her office, and she responded with all the expected condolences and sorrow. But as he observed her, he struggled to contain his anger. Those tears are fake, he seethed inwardly. She's probably thrilled because now she can move forward with her plan. However, he managed to maintain his composure until he left. As soon as Daniel left, Susan hurried out of her office, practically skipping down the hall to tell Grant Nicholson the news. Grant was taken aback by Susan's sudden appearance and the news she delivered. Although he started offering condolences, Susan cut him off. Can't you see? This is what we've been waiting for. With his father gone, Daniel inherits everything. I can file for divorce, sort out the property, and then we can finally be together. Grant felt his excitement matching Susan's. I can't believe the waiting is over. So, when do you plan to file for divorce? After a brief pause, Susan replied, I don't want to seem insensitive. I'll wait until after the funeral and memorial service before filing. That makes sense, Grant agreed. But don't delay too long. It might take me a while to handle things with Greta. In the following days, Daniel was consumed by the somber tasks that come with a death in the family. His top priority was arranging his father's funeral. Despite his father not being religious, he had left clear instructions for a Jewish burial. So Daniel had to organize it for the next day. Once the burial plans were set, Daniel started planning a memorial service for those who couldn't make it to the burial. Although Daniel didn't have other family, his father had built a network of friends throughout his life, and they came to pay their respects. Daniel's own friends and co-workers also offered their condolences, which gave him some comfort in the midst of grief. Attending both the burial and the memorial with Susan was tough for Daniel, not just because of the sorrow, but also because he had to be around her. She played the role of the grieving wife convincingly, but Daniel knew her true feelings, which fueled his bitterness towards her. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawyer reached out about his divorce proceedings, but given everything else going on, Daniel asked to postpone it. "I'll need some time to sort things out," he explained. "My life is pretty hectic right now." After the memorial service, a new issue surfaced. Paloma asked Daniel when he wanted her and Marco to leave the house. Daniel was taken aback. "You can't leave," he insisted. "Firstly, you have nowhere else to go, and I won't kick you out. Plus, leaving the house empty could attract trouble. And if you move, Marco might have to switch schools, which I don't want to happen. You both need to stay, at least for a while." Paloma was grateful, knowing Daniel's kindness was the main reason for his decision. After his father's burial and the conclusion of the services, Daniel reached out to his father's lawyer to figure out what needed to be done with his father's estate. The lawyer provided Daniel with a detailed list of tasks related to the probate process, along with an unexpected addition. Ezra had requested an early reading of his will, even before it went to probate. Furthermore, his father had left a specific list of people to invite to the reading, which Daniel understood when he saw it. "I have a request," Daniel told the family lawyer. "To ensure the reading is as official as possible, can we hold it at your law office? If it's there and your office handles the invitations, I think it's more likely that everyone who should be there will come." The lawyer readily agreed. On the day of the reading, Daniel and Susan arrived at the attorney's office separately. They exchanged polite greetings as they took their seats around the small conference table in the law library. Except for his father's services, they hadn't spent much time together. Despite her outward calm, Daniel could sense Susan's excitement. He, however, remained composed. Shortly after, Paloma entered and introduced herself to the attorney. Susan was taken aback and angrily asked Daniel, "What's she doing here?" Daniel looked at her calmly. She was invited. Before Susan could respond, she was surprised to see Grant Nicholson enter. "You were invited too?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm not entirely sure why, but the invitation was quite straightforward." Just then, the attorney stood up and purposefully cleared his throat. "May I have your attention, please? It seems that everyone who was invited is here. The late Mr. Morgan wanted each of you to be present for the reading of his last will and testament," he said in a solemn tone. "I won't bore you with all the legal details of his will. Instead, Mr. Morgan wanted me to get straight to the point." He cleared his throat again. "Firstly, the late Mr. Morgan appointed Daniel Morgan, his only child, as the executor of his will. Daniel will handle paying any owed taxes, settling debts, and managing the distribution of the estate's assets according to his father's wishes. Daniel has agreed to take on this role and has already begun the process of handling the estate's financial matters." Susan quickly glanced at Grant, giving him a brief smile of expectation. "Now, on to the distribution of assets," the attorney continued. "The first bequest concerns Mr. Morgan's home where he lived for the last 27 years, along with the land it sits on. His will states, 'I leave my home and grounds to Paloma Contreras, in appreciation for her devoted care during my illness and hardships. I also leave any remaining funds in my checking account to assist her with expenses.'" "What?" Susan exclaimed in surprise. "How can he leave his house to that maid? It should go to Daniel." "Yes, you're correct," Paloma added, regaining her composure. "It should go to Daniel, not me." She looked at Daniel for support, but he avoided her gaze. "Regardless," the attorney continued, "Mr. Morgan's wishes were clear. Now, if I may proceed to the second bequest." Once the group quieted down, the attorney resumed. "The second bequest concerns the Andy Warhol painting hanging in my living room. I leave the Warhol to the Birch Grove Mansion and Museum to be included in its permanent collection." "Oh my God!" Nicholson exclaimed. "No, that's completely wrong," Susan yelled. "He can't do that. He was supposed to leave the Warhol to Daniel." "I apologize, Mrs. Morgan, but Mr. Morgan specifically left the Warhol to Birch Grove," the attorney stated solemnly. "He wants it to be displayed prominently in the museum." "But that means Daniel gets nothing," Susan cried out. "His dad cut him out of the will. That's not fair." "Ladies and gentlemen," the attorney continued loudly, "if I could have your attention, I haven't finished reading the terms of the bequest. Please note that the second bequest Mr. Morgan made comes with conditions. The will states, "My gift to Birch Grove is dependent on two requirements. First, Birch Grove must immediately and permanently end all professional connections with Mrs. Susan Morgan. Second, Mr. Grant Nicholson, Birch Grove's executive director, must immediately and permanently cease the relationship he has with Mrs. Susan Morgan. If either of these conditions is not met, ownership of the War Hall will go to the War Hall Museum in Pittsburgh." He directed his gaze at Grant Nicholson. "Just so you know, sir, I've notified Pittsburgh of this conditional bequest just before this meeting. The War Hall Museum will closely monitor your compliance with these conditions." "This is absurd!" Susan exclaimed. "That nosy old man has no business in our personal lives." She turned to Daniel. "You're behind this, aren't you? You're trying to cheat me out of what's rightfully mine." "I would never do that, Susan. In fact, I have what's legally yours right here." With that, he handed her the envelope he had brought to the meeting. She tore it open and looked at the contents as if they were in a foreign language. "What's this?" "That's your legal notice that I filed for divorce," he informed her. Then, taking out his iPhone and snapping a photo to document his action, he said sternly, "Susan Morgan, you've been officially served." "You jerk! You can't divorce me! I'm divorcing you!" she screamed. Daniel simply smiled. As Susan kept yelling, she didn't notice Grant slipping out of the room quietly. When she finally realized he was gone, she rushed after him. Meanwhile, Paloma was trying to reason with Daniel. "This doesn't seem fair, Daniel. Mr. Morgan should have left his house to you, not to me. You're his son. It doesn't seem right that you're left with nothing." Daniel smiled now. "Paloma, it's okay. My dad and I talked about this. He cared about you and Marco, and wanted to make sure you were looked after when he was gone. He knew I agreed, and that this was what I wanted too." He held her shoulders and looked at her closely. "Can't you see? He was a tough, old-fashioned man who struggled to express his feelings. He didn't know how to say how much he appreciated the care you provided, the companionship you offered, and how you didn't take any nonsense from him. This was his way of showing his love." She wiped her tears. "Marco and we loved him too, Daniel." Susan rushed down the Birch Grove hallway to Grant's office. Ignoring his secretary, she burst into her boss's office. Grant, she gasped. "This is amazing news. With the War Hall in its collection, Birch Grove will attract tons of new visitors. You'll be head of the most prestigious art museum around." "Thank you, Susan," he replied cautiously. "I think you're right. And once things calm down," she continued, "we won't have to keep our relationship a secret anymore. Just like you've always wanted." His expression hardened. "Did you not hear the condition added to the will's bequest?" he asked sharply. "That can't be legally binding," she retorted. "It might stir up chatter among the country club crowd, but it'll blow over soon." "Except for the War Hall Museum," he countered. "They'd love to add such an important piece to their collection, so they'll be keeping a close eye on us." The quiver in her voice showed her worry. "But that can't be legal. No judge would enforce such a demand." Now Grant got mad. "You really think Birch Grove can fight the War Hall Museum in court? Do you know how much money they have? The Carnegie Foundation backs them. If they sue, our legal bills could ruin us." He stood and handed his ex-lover some papers. "I'm sorry, Susan, but I've already talked to Mr. Worthington. Starting today, you're no longer employed at Birch Grove." "Grant, you can't do that, not after everything between us." Then she got louder. "Plus, you don't want me telling your wife about us." "I've already come clean to her," he said coldly. "And once I'm done here, I'm going home to apologize some more. Hopefully, being the wife of Birch Grove's director will help ease her pain. Now it's time for you to leave the mansion. We'll send your severance check in the mail." She glared at him, her fists tight at her sides. He took a step back, fearing she might attack. Instead, she turned and marched away, heading to her old office. She quickly grabbed a few things and left. Passing her secretary's desk, Evita asked, "Are you leaving, Mrs. Morgan?" "Yes," Susan replied, not even looking at her. As she walked out, Evita called after her, "Adios, puta." Then she rushed to Christina's desk to spill the news. Daniel was rummaging in the fridge for dinner when he heard keys in the front door. Stepping into the living room, he saw Susan enter, looking upset. When she spotted her soon-to-be ex-husband, her expression turned angry. "You're behind all this, aren't you? How long have you known about Grant and me?" "Long enough to ruin your plan," he fired back. "So you convinced Ezra to change his will," she said bitterly. "He was going to leave everything to you, and you talked him into changing it. Why would you do that?" "I did it to make sure you'd never get it, no matter what. When I heard about your plan to claim the War Hall as community property, Donating it to Birch Grove stopped that, and it gave me the power to end your affair with Grant. I figured he'd choose the war hall over you. So you really hate me that much? He stared at her, furious. After what you tried? You bet, he yelled. She looked stunned by his anger. After a moment, he calmed down. There's one thing I need to know. Did you ever love me? She sighed and sank into a chair. Maybe at the beginning, when we first got married. You were ambitious, full of potential. I thought you'd succeed and take me along. She shook her head, bitterness in her tone. But then I saw the path you chose. Soon after, I started looking for something better. So it's always been about money and status for you. Love and a good life weren't enough. How quaint, she smirked. That's what losers settle for when they can't win. Family, friends, community, you call that losing? I want respect, the kind that comes with money and power. That's what matters. The rest is just decoration. He almost argued, but decided against it. What's next, then? Her confidence faded. I am leaving. Thanks to you, I'm ruined in this town. Once I pack, I'll be gone. And don't worry, I won't fight the divorce if we split assets fairly. I just want my share of our savings and the house proceeds. Sorry, Susan, but we don't own this house. It belongs to the university. She clenched her teeth. You always had brains. Why couldn't you be more ambitious? Without waiting for an answer, she headed to the bedroom. After a while, she returned with a suitcase, a garment bag, and a cosmetics kit. I'm leaving now, she informed him. My lawyer will contact yours, and we'll get the divorce done quickly. She shot him a resentful glance. At least we both agree on one thing, ending this marriage. He looked at her questioningly. So, where are you headed? As far away from here as possible. Somewhere to start fresh, hopefully with someone more driven. Watching her depart, Daniel thought, asterisk good riddance. For once, Susan kept her word, and their divorce proceeded smoothly. Daniel begrudged paying alimony, but with his soon-to-be ex-wife unemployed, he couldn't argue much. It's a small price to pay to be rid of her, especially considering what she tried to do to you, his lawyer advised. Meanwhile, managing his father's estate kept Daniel occupied. Every day brought new tasks, distributing death certificates, stopping his father's Social Security, notifying the IRS, and filing taxes. After classes, he often found himself at his father's house, sorting through possessions, paying bills, and handling financial matters. To his surprise, his father had used paper checks for everything. Until he transitioned to electronic payments, Daniel wrote more checks in a few weeks than he had in years. Though time-consuming, the task allowed Daniel to spend time with Paloma and Marco. His campus house felt dark and empty, while his father's home felt vibrant. He often stayed for dinner with them, feeling guilty about imposing but unable to resist Paloma's insistence. Even as he neared completion of his father's affairs, she urged him to continue dining with them. It's hard to cook for just us two, she explained, and he happily obliged. Being part of their family provided solace for the grief of his father's passing and the bitterness of his divorce. A few weeks later, Daniel got a call from his father's lawyer. The probate court approved the final accounting of your dad's estate. You're clear to handle his assets as he wanted. Really? I thought probate took longer. The lawyer chuckled. Usually, yeah, but your dad's will got fast-tracked. Might have something to do with Birch Grove's big shots on the board. They're eager to get their hands on their new prize. Anyway, you're good to go. An hour later, Grant Nicholson called, asking about when Birch Grove could get the war hall. We followed your dad's will to the letter, and now that it's done with probate, we're ready for the transfer. Despite resolving legal issues, a new snag came up. The museum curator insisted on handling the war hall's packing and transport, but it had to sync with the security company, which had to disconnect all the safety systems. It was a tricky task. The handover and dismantling would take most of the day. As he awaited updates, Nicholson felt like a kid on Christmas. Tomorrow, Birch Grove would have its most valuable artwork. To mark the occasion, the museum planned a special showing for the board and guests the next evening. The awkwardness with Susan was behind him. The museum's future looked bright. After making sure the security company would watch over his dad's house during the war hall transfer, Daniel took Paloma and Marco for a day out in the Poconos. They hiked a beautiful trail, had lunch at the Flagstaff Lodge, and rode the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway. When they got back home, everyone had left except the security guard. The living room was tidy, but Marilyn Monroe's smiling face was gone, and they all felt its absence. Trying to lift the mood, Daniel suggested ordering pizza for dinner. They all enjoyed the pizzas, and after the long day, They were all exhausted. Marco fell asleep, and Daniel put him to bed. As he headed for the door, Paloma asked him to stay the night for safety since the security systems were down. After some hesitation, he agreed. When Paloma went to her room, Daniel settled into his father's bed. Memories kept him awake at first, but soon he drifted off. Later, he was startled awake by a noise in the hallway. As he sat up, Paloma entered, slipped under the covers, and kissed him, saying, "Please, Daniel, it's been so long for me, and I've been so lonely." In the heat of the moment, Daniel forgot his objections and kissed her back with fervor. The evening of the Warhol installation celebration at Birch Grove arrived. Grant Nicholson got there early, leaving his wife to arrive separately to make a grand entrance, as he put it. As he was checking the list for the event, he was surprised by a knock on his office door. The museum's curator stood there, looking troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked impatiently. "Sir, there's a problem with the Warhol," she said nervously. "What, is it damaged?" "No, sir, nothing like that. It just doesn't seem quite right." "Doesn't seem right? What do you mean?" "Well, some of the colors don't look accurate." "It's an artist proof. It doesn't have to be perfect," Nicholson snapped. The curator winced but persisted. "And Warhol's signature, sir, it's not faded as it should be. It should have faded since it was signed back in the 60s. "Is that the issue? How do you know what ink Warhol used? Just make sure everything's ready. The guests will be here soon." But the curator stood her ground. "That's not all, sir. The problem is it's the wrong size." "What?" "Yes, sir. Warhol's Marilyn Monroe is 36 by 36 inches, I checked. A proof should be the same size. But this print is only 35 inches square." Worthington was stunned. "So what does that mean?" The curator looked distressed. "Sir, this print is a fake, a forgery. It can't be authentic." "Oh my God!" Nicholson exclaimed, sinking back in his chair as he tried to grasp the full weight of her revelation. "Are you sure?" he asked desperately. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry." He gazed into the distance, shocked by what was unfolding. Sir, the curator interrupted nervously. "What should we do? Hang it up anyway?" "Are you out of your mind?" Nicholson yelled, making the woman flinch. "If people find out we hung a fake artwork knowingly, it would destroy Birch Grove." He pointed at her. "Take it down and hide it. Tell your team to turn off the lights and put up a sign saying event canceled." When she hesitated, Nicholson urged, "Do it now before it's too late." The curator hurried off, leaving Nicholson to ponder the catastrophe. Suddenly, he rushed to his secretary's desk. "Call the guard at the entrance. Tell him to chain the gate shut. Quickly." The secretary paused, unsure. "What should I tell the guests?" "Just say it's canceled due to an emergency, and no more calls, got it?" She nodded, but the phone rang. "Sir," she said nervously, "it's the curator again. Should I put her through?" "What now?" Nicholson grumbled. "Fine. I'll take it in my office. You handle the gate." Once in his office, he answered the call, and the curator spoke urgently. "It's the caterer, sir. He wants to know what to do with the food." "Tell him to take it back," Nicholson snapped. "We don't need it." "He says he can't, sir. It's already set out. He says it's against the law to take it back." "Then tell him to donate it to the homeless shelter." "What about the champagne and caviar, sir?" "Just do it," he said curtly, hanging up the phone. Nicholson slouched in his chair, feeling overwhelmed by the situation. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered repeatedly. "What's going on here?" demanded a familiar voice. "I had to walk all the way from the front gate to find out." Startled, Nicholson looked up to see his board chairman's flushed face. Panic surged through him as he searched for a way to explain the mess. "Well, Mr. Worthington, we've avoided a disaster. When we discovered issues with the Warhol, I knew you wouldn't want the event to proceed." "What kind of issues?" Worthington asked sternly, leaning closer. "It turns out the print is a fake, sir." "A fake?" Worthington exclaimed. "How could you let this happen? You're supposed to be experts. Did you even check it before hyping it up to the world?" "I understand your frustration, sir, but there were complications with the will, and then we had to coordinate with the security company. There was so much security at the old man's place." "Enough!" Worthington thundered. "Birch Grove will be a laughingstock, and you're to blame. Consider yourself fired effective immediately. Get out of here as soon as you can clear the mess you've made." Before Nicholson could respond, Worthington stormed off, ignoring the trembling receptionist nearby. "Oh God, I'm ruined," Nicholson lamented. "Once this spreads, I won't find work at any museum." Just then, his secretary approached. "The phone's for you," she said nervously. "I said no more calls," Nicholson snapped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Nicholson." But it's your wife. She says if you don't talk to her, don't bother coming home tonight. Nicholson surrendered. Okay, put her on, he conceded. When he heard his wife's voice, he knew she was furious. You better have a good reason for this, Grant. I've been stuck in traffic forever. People keep asking me what's going on, and I have no answers. If you wanted to embarrass me, you've succeeded. It's simple, dear, Nicholson replied calmly. We found out the Warhol we were about to display is a fake. A fake? She exclaimed. We couldn't show a fake, so we canceled the event. It's unfortunate we found out at the last minute. He sighed, resigning to his fate. Worthington fired me, despite my efforts for Birch Grove. He fired you? She gasped. This is too much. Don't bother coming home. My lawyer will start divorce proceedings tomorrow. He sighed again, defeated. Do you understand? She pressed. Yes, dear. As the call ended, he slumped over his desk, feeling utterly defeated. Paloma learned about the disastrous event at Birch Grove and Grant Nicholson's firing from Christina. Rushing to inform Daniel, he wasn't surprised, finding satisfaction in the outcome. I promised I'd make him pay for what he did to my marriage, Daniel said confidently. Puzzled, Paloma asked, But how did you know this would happen? I didn't exactly, Daniel explained. But I set things in motion so that he'd likely cause his own downfall. I didn't expect it to be so public, but I knew the result would be fitting, considering what he and Susan tried to do. Paloma scrutinized him. So what did you do exactly, Senor Daniel? I'm still not clear. Daniel grinned. Let's go to my office at the university. I can show you there. In Daniel's cluttered office, he motioned for Paloma to sit before explaining. First, let's talk about Susan. She planned to keep her affair secret until my father passed away from Parkinson's disease. With his deteriorating health, she figured it wouldn't be long. She couldn't file for divorce before inheriting Dad's estate, hoping to claim half of everything, especially the valuable Warhol. Her lawyer thought they could argue it was communal property. But when I found out about her plan, I convinced Dad to leave the Warhol to Birch Grove. Not only would it be out of Susan's reach, but we could also use it against her, he smiled. And it worked. When Grant realized Birch Grove could only get the Warhol by cutting ties with my wife, he abandoned Susan immediately. Daniel became lost in thought. I'm not sure if Grant truly loved Susan, but I'm pretty confident she saw him as a means to climb the social ladder. Once my father's will was revealed, she lost her job, her lover, and, naturally, her marriage to me. Everything turned out just as I had hoped. By the way, a friend mentioned the other day that Susan has moved to Allentown. Apparently, the only job she could find was at a telemarketing center selling insurance. Instead of moving up, my ex-wife has fallen quite a bit. That's probably the most fitting punishment I could have wished for her. I can see how you got even with Susan, Paloma agreed. And in my opinion, she got what she deserved. Cheating on your husband is bad enough, but scheming to take advantage of you and your father, that's horrible, she added, using the Spanish pronunciation. But what about Nicholson? What did you do to him? Daniel grinned. Did you hear about what happened at Birch Grove last night? Well, some of it. I was mostly shocked to find out your father's artwork wasn't real. A sad expression crossed her face. I'm relieved Senor Morgan didn't have to hear that cruel news. Daniel looked at her with appreciation. It speaks volumes that your first thought is for my father. He stood up from his chair. But don't be too saddened for him. Reaching behind a filing cabinet, he retrieved the Marilyn Monroe teaching aid he used in his intro course and placed it on the desk. She looked at him with uncertainty. A wise writer once said that the best way to keep something safe is to hide it in plain sight. Let me show you something. He turned the print over, revealing the reverse side covered in brown paper. Carefully, he peeled back the paper, exposing an inscription. To Ezra Morgan, for all his hard work. Andy Warhol. This is the real print? Paloma exclaimed. But it's the one you use in your classes. You mentioned that to me. It's just here in your office. Daniel smiled and nodded. But when did you do the switch? The other print was hanging in your dad's living room long before Marco and I moved in. And it was way before you found out about Susan's plans. And with all the security Senor Morgan had, how could you have swapped it? Daniel grinned. At first, Dad didn't think his print was worth much. I mean, Warhol sold his screen prints originally for only a few $100 each. But as his works became more popular, Dad started worrying about having a real artist proof in his home. So we talked about it, and I suggested we swap the real thing for a cheap print. I'd keep the real Warhol here and use it in my lectures so no one would think it was valuable. Dad would keep the fake on his living room wall. Later, as Warhol's value kept going up, Dad got the idea to install security to guard it. He thought no one would doubt the realness of a work protected by all those gadgets. It became like a game to him, always adding more high-tech stuff to protect it. Daniel smiled at Paloma. Luckily, there was never a break-in attempt, but I'm sure all that security made Nicholson think he was getting the real deal. So you swapped the prints before I started working for your dad? Exactly. I planned to swap them back when Dad passed, but after I found out about Grant and Susan, I saw a way to get back at both of them. After talking to Dad that night, he had his lawyer redo his will so Nicholson would dump Susan. Then I let Grant take the fake Warhol, thinking he'd want to show it off ASAP. And just like Susan, he lost his job, his marriage, and his reputation. So what's next? My plan is to wait for the dust to settle at Birch Grove. Once it does, I'll quietly tell the board I found the real Warhol in a storage container Dad had. After they verify it, I'll ask them to hang it with a plaque honoring Dad's connection to Warhol. Don't you regret not having the Warhol for yourself? It was worth a lot, he smiled. Honestly, not at all. I never wanted the responsibility of owning such an important artwork. And as for the money, Susan was the one chasing wealth and status, not me. After seeing what it did to her, I'm glad to be rid of it. Then his smile widened. Plus, I hope all this helps me achieve a more important goal. She looked at him with uncertainty. What's that goal? To be part of a new family. What? What new family? Daniel walked over to her and held her hands. A family with you, Marco, and me. When the graduate student who had come to see Professor Morgan saw the couple embracing, she smiled and quietly left. Once she was far down the hall, she called a fellow student. Remember how we were worried about Professor Morgan after he lost his dad and his wife? Well, I think our favorite prof is going to be fine.